The air on the quarterdeck of the USS Independence was brisk, tasting of salt and discipline, like every proper Navy morning at Naval Station Norfolk. I could feel the electric anticipation rippling along the deck. The crew moved with a measured urgency, their uniforms crisp, their faces set. The grey hull of the destroyer stretched out behind me like the backbone of some ancient steel leviathan, bristling with radows and the silent, watchful intent of 300 sailors. The ship's bell cut through the quiet, the sound sharp and ceremonial, echoing against the steel and over the water. A petty officer's voice followed, steady and sure. Executive officer arriving. I took a deep breath, smoothed my white service dress over my hips, and stepped onto the brow with a posture drilled into me through a decade of discipline. My gold oak leaf, shining bright on my collar, caught the morning sun as if determined to prove itself. I'd waited my whole life for this exact moment, and I'd rehearsed it more times than I could count. But I never imagined the audience I'd have today. Standing on the pier, among the families and honored guests, I saw two men who defined my entire world and everything I'd ever struggled to escape: my father, Gerald Harris, and my younger brother, Sam. Dad was still thick with the weight of his own Navy years, retired chief petty officer, proud, broad-shouldered, always a bit too loud. Sam, meanwhile, had all the effortless charm and confidence of the family's a golden boy, already a lieutenant junior grade at 26, standing tall in his sharp blue uniform. Their faces were painted with the same familiar smugness, until they spotted me. I watched, almost amused, as the recognition dawned on their faces, pride flickering out like a candle in the wind. For a heartbeat, my father's jaw went slack. Sam's salute was automatic, his hand snapping up in reflex before his mind had caught up. I didn't smile. I didn't give them anything. This was not a moment for reunion or reconciliation. It was a reckoning. What they couldn't see, what no one on that pier could know, was how far I'd come in just 12 hours, and how much I'd had to leave behind to get here. The night before, I'd stood in my parents' living room in Roanoke, a place so cluttered with my brother's trophies, Dad's framed photos from decades in the Navy, and not a single hint of my own existence. You'd think I was a guest rather than a daughter. My old duffel bag sat at my feet, packed with the practiced efficiency of someone who had always been ready to leave. Dad's finger jabbed at me like a weapon. I spent 20 years in the fleet, Kelly. I know what it takes. His voice was a low, throbbing roar, the kind you feel in your bones. Sam lounged in the armchair, smirking, basking in the glow of my condemnation. My son's out there doing real Navy work. And you just wash out of every tough post, hiding behind a desk. How is that a career? The air in that room felt thick, suffocating, as if my own achievements couldn't breathe inside these four walls. It was always the same. Sam was the hero. I was the asterisk. Every time he got a medal, Dad displayed it with pride. Every time I came home from another deployment, there was no banner, no parade, just a polite, half-hearted "that's nice, honey." That night, Dad stepped close enough for me to smell his aftershave and the anger beneath it. You are a disappointment to this family's Navy tradition. Get out. His words weren't just about this house. He was throwing me out of his world, trying to erase me from a legacy he'd spent years pretending was only his and Sam's. He wanted to see me break down, to yell or cry, to prove him right. But I had learned, over the years, how to build a wall inside myself. I met his gaze, my voice flat and precise, as if I was answering a routine order. Roger that, sir. Then I turned, picked up my bag, and walked out, not looking back. The silence behind me was almost satisfying. I knew he thought my composure was a kind of defeat, a final whimper of a failed daughter. But it was nothing of the kind. It was discipline. It was self-control. It was everything the Navy had taught me about keeping your head high when the world tried to push you down. Standing on that quarterdeck the next morning, with Dad and Sam forced to acknowledge me in front of 100 witnesses, I realized how different my Navy was from theirs. For them, the Navy was tradition, a father-to-son story told in medals and ship assignments. For me, it was something I'd earned, sweat for, and almost lost, again and again. My journey was invisible to them, but it was the only one that mattered. They didn't know it yet, but today was the day everything changed. There are places in every family home that feel like museums to someone else's glory. For me, it was always our living room in Roanoke. Every shelf and corner was packed with Sam's sports trophies, Dad's shadow boxes full of medals and rank insignias, and a few faded photos of my parents from their younger, happier years. But if you looked for signs of me, a childhood drawing, a diploma, even a snapshot from one of my deployments, you wouldn't find a single trace. Sometimes I wondered if I'd been invisible all along. The night before the family cruise, I stood in that living room with my bag at my feet, staring at the rug like it could offer me an escape. Dad's presence filled every inch of the space. His voice had that familiar edge, the sound that always promised a fight, never a conversation. "You think hiding behind those desk jobs makes you Navy?" he barked, and I felt Sam's eyes on me, smug and amused. "My son here," Dad always said, and my son with an emphasis that made it sound like Sam was his only child, is an officer on a real destroyer. "Kelly, you keep ducking out of tough assignments, shuffling paperwork instead of doing real work. I know what's required. You don't have it." I'd heard it all before. I'd heard it at my college graduation, when I announced I'd be joining the Navy as an officer, not enlisting like Dad. I heard it at every holiday, every family dinner where Sam's small accomplishments were praised and my larger ones overlooked or misunderstood. Sam never tried to hide his favoritism. He'd lean back in the armchair, tossing a glance my way, half pitying, half mocking. He was the family's natural leader, the one who looked good in uniform, who could charm any superior, who got promoted fast and seemed to glide through Navy life. Me. I was always a book smart, always a too quiet, either overthinker in a world that prized bravado. I learned early on to count every small slight, every time my father's disappointment surfaced. I kept a running tally in my mind. The time Dad skipped my commissioning ceremony because Sam had a soccer playoff. The year he told my mother money was a tightie for my coding camp but bought Sam a car 3 weeks later. My academic medals? Shoved in a drawer. Sam's JV football trophies? Lined up across the mantel for every guest to see. Even Mom, Linda, never challenged the status quo. Her way was peacekeeping, not justice. She'd reach over during these tense moments and pat my hand, her touch gentle but useless. "You know how your father gets about the Navy," as she'd whisper, as if that made it okay. It didn't. But I had learned how to adapt, how to make my own space when the family wouldn't give me one. By the time I left home at 18, I'd grown so used to being overlooked that I started seeing it as a form of freedom, a way to build a self outside their stories. That night, Dad pressed closer, his voice dropping low but gaining venom. "You're a failure, Kelly. You've let this family down." The words didn't sting like they once did. I'd heard them too many times. He wanted a reaction. He wanted tears or anger, something he could point to as proof that I wasn't tough enough. Instead, I stood there, every muscle trained by years of discipline. I stared right through him, letting all the old pain harden into something smooth and cold. "Roger that, sir," I said, just as I would have on the bridge, responding to an order I disagreed with but had to carry out. His eyes flashed in anger, but there was nothing left to say. I grabbed my bag and walked out into the night, breathing easier with every step away from that house. I didn't slam the door. I didn't look back. I drove through the quiet Virginia streets toward Norfolk, my car slicing through the darkness. There was no dramatic soundtrack in my head, no self-pity, no rage. Just a sharp, clean determination to move forward, to be done with old battles. I found a cheap motel near the base, a place so generic it could have been anywhere in America. The walls were beige, the carpet worn, but it was my own space, no judgments, no expectations. I laid out my uniform for the next day, polished the gold oak leaf until it gleamed, and checked my orders one last time. The plan was simple: do my job. Let Dad and Sam enjoy their big day on the family cruise. They had no idea what was waiting for them on the quarterdeck. They had no idea it was my command now. Lying in the quiet, I realized how much of my life had been shaped by the battle for their approval. All those years I tried to win them over, with good grades, with promotions, with quiet competence. None of it had ever been enough. Maybe, I thought, it never would be. Maybe that was the point. As the sun rose over Norfolk, turning the water gold and pink, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: anticipation. Not for their praise, but for the moment I would finally step into the role I'd earned, whether they saw it or not. To understand how my father ended up standing rigid on my quarterdeck, saluting the Rafale he'd thrown out the night before, you have to understand the two different navies we lived in, and the vast gulf that separated his expectations from my reality. In his world, the Navy was a birthright, a tradition passed from father to son, not to daughters. It was all brass, battleships, and hard-earned respect. He'd built his entire identity around service, but his story always stopped at Chief Petty Officer, a ceiling he could never crack. My brother Sam had been the chosen one to live out the dream my dad never quite achieved. I was just a footnote, an awkward shadow at the family table, the one who didn't fit the legend. There was a dinner I'll never forget. It was at a steakhouse in downtown Brooklyn, one of those dark, wood-paneled places where the laughter is loud and the prices make your eyes water. We were there to celebrate Sam's promotion to lieutenant junior grade. The whole extended family came out: cousins, uncles, people who'd barely spoken to me in years. Dad was in his element, standing to make a toast. He talked about the Harris family legacy, the tradition of service, and how Sam was now stationed on a Eurelia ship, the USS Roosevelt. He called it the sharp end of the spear. Sam beamed, soaking in every word, every compliment, every proud pat on the back. Then, as an afterthought, Dad turned to me, holding his glass but not really looking at my face. "And Kelly's been keeping busy, too." His tone was light, almost playful, but underneath, there was a chill that no smile could hide. "Tell us what you've been up to, sweetheart," a mom chimed in, giving me an encouraging nod. I could feel every eye at the table on me. I explained that I'd just finished a grueling, highly classified advanced course in integrated air and missile defense, a program most officers would give anything to attend. Dad snorted. A sharp, dismissive laugh. "More school? In my day, you learned on deck plates, not in a classroom." He always found a way to frame my education as a weakness, a liability. Sam grinned, jumping in with his favorite joke. Staff Sergeant Kelly, reporting for paperwork duty. He knew it was the wrong rank and the wrong branch, but that was the point, a way to erase my achievements with a laugh. Dad, meanwhile, just called me the professor. He'd say it with a gentle chuckle, as if my love for learning was some harmless quirk, like collecting stamps. I smiled politely, stirring my iced tea, but inside I was tallying the score. The coldness at that table wasn't just about that dinner. It was the echo of every and maybe next year. Every time I was told money was too tight for my dreams but somehow just enough for Sam's new car or sports gear. My academic awards got tucked away in drawers, while Sam's Little League trophies were dusted and displayed on the mantel for every visitor to admire. Mom would pat my hand in her soft, non-committal way, whispering, "You know how your father gets," as if that was supposed to make up for the rest. Her words were meant to heal, but in truth, they just papered over the cracks, making it easier for everyone to ignore the uncomfortable reality. In their eyes, I wasn't attacked, so I didn't need defending. But I knew better. There was another world, a place my family couldn't even imagine. In the pitch-black nerve center of a warship, the Combat Information Center, I was no longer the professor or the afterthought. I was the tactical action officer, the one who called the shots, the one everyone listened to. I remember one fleet exercise as clearly as if it happened yesterday. The air in the CIC was cold and thick with anticipation, every surface lit by the eerie blue glow of monitors and controls. The only sound was the soft hum of electronics and the steady flow of status reports. Suddenly, an alarm screamed through the speakers, a sound engineered to jolt even the most exhausted sailor awake. "Vampire, vampire, vampire," shouted the sensor operator, his voice tight but focused. "Enemy missiles inbound. Multiple targets. Supersonic. Sea skimming, coming in fast." In that split second, the fate of $1 billion warship and 300 lives rested squarely on my shoulders. There was no time for self-doubt, no margin for error. All those years of studying, all the nights that mocked my book smarts, fused into one perfect, clear instant. My commands were ice calm, clipped, authoritative. Engage with SM2. Illuminate with forward director. Spin up CIWS. I need a firing solution now. My team responded instantly, moving like a single organism, every motion rehearsed and flawless. For 30 agonizing seconds, the ship's defensive systems unleashed a storm of firepower into the night. Then, silence. The threats disappeared from our screens, reduced to harmless debris. The CIC let out a collective breath. Over the comm circuit, my captain's voice rumbled with rare respect. "Damn fine work, Commander." 2 words. That's all. But in that moment, they meant more than every one of Sam's trophies, every forced smile or patronizing word I'd ever gotten at home. That was the split in my life. At home, I was a disappointment. On the ship, I was indispensable. As I lay awake in that motel, preparing for the new day, I let those 2 worlds swirl together inside me. Maybe the people back in Roanoke would never understand what I did. Maybe they never wanted to. But on the deck of the Independence, among sailors who trusted my voice, I was exactly where I belonged. After walking out of my childhood home, I didn't waste time driving aimlessly or calling a friend to vent. That urge to seek comfort or validation was a luxury I'd learned to leave behind. I checked into a no-name motel outside Norfolk, one of those places that smells faintly of bleach and desperation, the kind frequented by transient sailors and lost truckers. The walls were a generic off-white, the curtains thin, but the quiet was welcome after the combative noise of my father's house. There was no raging storm inside me, no tears. Instead, there was a profound, almost clinical calm. I emptied my duffel bag and laid out my service dress whites with the precision the Navy had drilled into me. Every crease had to be perfect, every brass button gleaming. I polished my gold oak leaf until I could see my own reflection, stern, determined, a reminder that I wasn't that overlooked girl anymore. I was Lieutenant Commander Kelly Harris. I'd earned this. As I pressed my uniform, my mind replayed the walk to my car, the echo of Dad's words fading behind me. I realized, almost with surprise, that I wasn't angry, not anymore. I wasn't plotting some grand revenge or desperate for an apology. What I wanted was something simpler, to do my job and to let my actions speak for themselves. There was a certain freedom in that. For once, I didn't have to plan anything elaborate. Dad and Sam, in their predictability, had already set the stage for their own lesson. For weeks, Sam had bragged to anyone who would listen that he'd gotten Dad a coveted spot on their family day cruise aboard his ship, the Roosevelt. It was supposed to be their day, their ship, their stage. What they didn't know was that Navy schedules are set by rules, not family egos. I was the incoming executive officer of the Roosevelt, and my official arrival was set for that very morning, right at the start of the cruise. They saw it as their world. They had no idea that, by the book, it was about to become my command. That evening, as I checked my orders for the 100th time, I made a single phone call. My hands were steady as I dialed. Commander William Davis, my new commanding officer, picked up on the second ring. Commander Davis, this is LCDR Harris, I said, voice crisp with professionalism. Just confirming my arrival time for the family cruise and the executive officer's brief. His tone matched mine, clipped and matter-of-fact. Affirmative. XO. Crew's looking forward to meeting you. Your reputation precedes you. See you on the quarterdeck, 0800 sharp. I ended the call feeling lighter. His final words, your reputation precedes you, were a quiet validation that mattered more than anything my father could say. The next morning, the air at Naval Station Norfolk was thick with the briny scent of the Atlantic and diesel fuel. The Roosevelt towered above the pier, a grey wall of steel and confidence. Its radar masts and guns cast long shadows in the rising sun. I spotted Dad immediately, holding court as only a retired chief could, barking critiques about his sloppy linesy on the deck and telling Sam, loud enough for anyone nearby, how back in his day, things were different. Sam stood beside him, nodding along dutifully, playing the role of the favourite son. Their little performance was for the benefit of anyone who'd listen. Dad's voice carried down the pier, full of bluster and nostalgia. It was all so familiar, almost comical. They were reliving their private legend, one where I was written out of the script. Neither noticed me at first. I paused at the edge of the pier, taking in the scene, letting the memories roll over me one last time. I felt no fear, no bitterness, just a cold, clear finality. I started walking. Each step brought the ship, and my family, into sharper focus. I could see the ledger flipping in my mind, not with pain now, but with a sense of inevitability. Every nickname, every dinner where my victories were minimized and Sam's mistakes overlooked, none of it hurt anymore. It just clarified who I was. 20 yards from the gangway, the officer of the deck caught sight of my rank and stiffened. He barked a sharp order. The watch team straightened, and the petty officer of the watch rang the ship's bell. Executive officer arriving. The sound cut through the morning air, more powerful than any shout. In an instant, every sailor on the quarterdeck snapped to attention, Sam included, before his mind could catch up with his instincts. Dad froze mid-sentence, hands halfway through some grand gesture. I paused at the top of the gangway, letting the moment settle. This was it, the axis around which everything would turn. The world seemed to shrink to a narrow corridor of sunlight and steel as I set foot on the Roosevelt's gangway. Every step felt deliberate, each movement precise. 1,000 hours of training carried me forward, but my heart beat with something older, more personal. I held my chin high, eyes fixed ahead, refusing even a glance at my family as the ship's bell echoed in the morning air. The effect was immediate. Sam, caught between instinct and disbelief, snapped a textbook-perfect salute. His expression was a mask, shock, confusion, maybe even a glimmer of pride that he could barely acknowledge. But it was my father who truly froze. His arm hung in midair, his words dying on his lips. He was caught in the clash between the habits of a lifetime and the reality unfolding in front of him. His daughter, the Raphaelia, it was now the XO of a warship. Commander Davis stepped forward, his posture easy but his voice full of quiet authority. "Welcome aboard, XO Harris," he said, extending his hand. "We're glad to have you." I shook his hand with a firm, steady grip, feeling the eyes of the entire watch team on us. "Thank you, sir." Ready to get to work. There was no tremor in my voice, no uncertainty. The routine of Navy life closed around me like armor. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Sam lower his salute awkwardly, still unable to process that he'd just shown respect, publicly, officially, to the sister he'd spent years quietly undermining. Dad stood silent, his face drained of color, his shoulders squared by habit but slumped with something close to defeat. No one on the quarterdeck said a word. In the world of the Navy, rank and protocol are everything. For a moment, I was not the daughter or the sibling, I was the executive officer, and their silence was respect. Behind me, Dad and Sam seemed to shrink, suddenly irrelevant. For the first time in my life, the story no longer revolved around them. As Commander Davis and I walked into the heart of the ship, the chatter of the watch team and the sharp squawk of the radios filled the space. Duty, not drama, was now my focus. The Roosevelt came alive with the energy of sailors preparing for a cruise, and my attention snapped back to the endless stream of details and responsibilities that came with command. My father and brother faded from my mind, left standing together on the quarterdeck, ignored by everyone, their day of family pride turned inside out. They slipped quietly away before the cruise had even really begun. I wondered, only briefly, what story Dad would tell himself now. Would he rewrite the memory, explain away my position, pretend he'd always believed in me? Or would he finally face what he'd never wanted to see? None of that was my concern anymore. For the first time, I felt a genuine separation from their judgment, a freedom to be defined by my own merit and the trust of my crew. 6 months later, winter battered the North Atlantic, sending mountainous waves crashing over the bow of the Roosevelt. Outside, the world was a chaos of slate-grey sky and heaving black sea, but on the bridge there was a strange sense of calm, order enforced by discipline, trust, and training. I had the deck and the con, standing with my boots planted on the vibrating steel, my voice the anchor that steadied the watch. Helm, steady on course 270. Lee helm, ahead 15 knots. XO, came the response, immediate and confident. These two words, XO, here, had become the new soundtrack of my life. In this world, my judgment was valued, my decisions accepted without question. The crew didn't care who my family was, or what my father thought. They cared about the ship, the mission, and the person who led them. And I led from the front, not because of tradition, but because I'd earned it. Here, my presence brought stability, not disappointment. Here, I was home. That sense of belonging wasn't just about authority. It was about the quiet rituals that made the Roosevelt my real family. In the evenings, when the ship settled into its routine and the noise dropped to a low hum, I'd retreat to my stateroom to review reports. The room was small, impersonal, but it was mine. I'd make coffee, study the readiness metrics, sometimes lose myself in the silence. It was on one of those quiet nights, as I worked through supply inventories and training logs, that my phone buzzed. The text was from my mother. I hesitated before picking it up. She rarely reached out directly, preferring the safety of group chats and family emails. But this message was just for me. Your father told one of his old friends you're the XO of a destroyer. There was a long pause in the text. I think he was proud. I stared at the screen, letting the words sink in. Proud. It was the word I'd spent so many years chasing, the approval I'd built my life around. Yet as I sat there, coffee cooling, the engine's distant rumble beneath my feet, I felt only a quiet sense of peace. No elation, no surge of victory. Just closure. My value was no longer measured in his eyes. My validation came from the crew who relied on me, the sailors who trusted my orders in the middle of the world's most unforgiving ocean. Without replying, I set the phone down, turning my focus back to the ship, and to the legacy I was building every single day, far from home. Forging a story that was finally, unmistakably my own. The Navy taught me that family can be chosen just as surely as it can be inherited. The longer I served as XO of the Roosevelt, the more that truth revealed itself. My world no longer revolved around the living room in Roanoke or the old expectations echoing down from my childhood. Instead, my family wore coveralls and dog tags, spoke in acronyms, and trusted each other with their lives. We were forged in stress and in silence, in drills that left us exhausted and in crises that proved who we really were. It didn't matter if you were a brand new seaman or a crusty chief. What mattered was that you stood the watch, that you answered the call, that you never let your shipmates down. And as XO, I was their anchor, the steady hand that kept the crew focused, moving, and safe. There was a rhythm to shipboard life that never made sense to outsiders. Days ran together, measured not by clocks but by watches, drills, and the sea's endless moods. I walked the decks in the blue hours before dawn, the world reduced to shadow and steel, the only sound the wind rattling the signal halyards. I knew each sailor by name, knew who missed home, who played guitar in the mess, who could be trusted with a secret or a difficult conversation. I learned to spot trouble before it started, to sense morale shifts, to listen for the unspoken signals of fatigue, frustration, or pride. Those little acts of leadership, the check-ins, the late-night pep talks, the moments when I simply listened, did more for my credibility than any line in my service record. The old rules from my father's world didn't apply here. Respect had to be earned every single day, not inherited, not demanded. I took particular care with the new women on board. There were more of us now, but it was still easy to feel outnumbered, to worry about standing out for the wrong reasons. I tried to be the leader I'd needed when I was younger, the officer who didn't judge, who understood the pressures, who offered advice without ever making someone feel small. One evening, after a rough inspection, I found Ensign Carter, a sharp, determined young woman, sitting alone in the supply room, head in her hands. She'd made a mistake, something minor in the big scheme of things, but enough to eat at her confidence. I sat down on a crate beside her. "You know," I said quietly, "when I was your age, I nearly ran a patrol boat aground in front of an admiral." She looked up, surprised. "Really?" "Absolutely. And I thought I'd never recover. But I did. Not because I was perfect, but because I learned, and I owned it. That's all the Navy ever asks." She smiled, tension easing from her shoulders. "Thanks, Moments like that reminded me how far I'd come. I was no longer living in someone else's shadow. I was the mentor now, the proof that women belonged on the bridge and at the head of the table. Yet, no matter how settled I felt aboard ship, the ghosts of home had a way of finding me. The message from my mother about my father's pride lingered in my mind long after I'd set down my phone. In some alternate universe, that text might have filled me with joy. But I realized with a kind of gentle surprise that I no longer needed it. There was a time when I would have done anything for a scrap of his approval. But something in me had changed. Maybe it was all those nights on watch, when the only thing between my crew and disaster was my voice on the comms. Maybe it was seeing my decisions hold up under fire, my calm steadiness keeping the ship on course while the ocean tried to tear us apart. I didn't measure my worth by anyone's expectations anymore, not Sam's, not my father's, not the Navy's old guard. My value was right here, in the steady hands of the helmsman, the trust of the petty officers, the quiet nods from sailors who knew I'd fight for them no matter what. As months rolled by, I found myself thinking less and less about Roanoke. The old house with its mismatched trophies and careful silences faded into memory, replaced by the hum and vibration of the Roosevelt. My real home was out here, moving with the tides, built of sweat, trust, and the discipline that Dad thought he owned. I started new traditions with my crew, movie nights in the mess, open-door hours in my stateroom, a running tally of the worst coffee in the fleet. We celebrated small victories together, a sailor making rank, a flawless drill, even just a day with calm seas and working internet. These moments bound us closer than any bloodline. Every so often, I'd stand alone on the weather deck, looking out at the vast, rolling Atlantic. Sometimes the water was gentle, glassy, and endless. Other times, it threatened to swallow the ship whole. Either way, I stood steady, shoulders squared, breathing in the salt air, feeling that deep, reassuring certainty I belonged here. Not because I'd finally earned my father's pride, but because I had found something stronger, my own. There was a strange peace that settled over me as the months went by, a steadiness that had little to do with calm seas and everything to do with the person I'd become. In the confined, humming world of the Roosevelt, I had found the kind of belonging that had always eluded me in Roanoke. Each morning began with the ritual of walking the ship, exchanging quiet nods with sailors headed to their stations, hearing the click and clatter of machinery, feeling the thrum of the engines deep beneath my feet. Out here, there were no old stories to rewrite, no narrow roles to fit into, just the constant proving of self, day after day. Sometimes I wondered if my father would recognize the leader I'd become, the woman who carried more responsibility in a single watch than he ever would have imagined for a daughter. But those thoughts faded quickly under the weight of real command. My focus was on my crew, on the endless stream of decisions that kept the Roosevelt safe and running smoothly. Leadership was a living thing here, as much about listening as it was about giving orders. There were hard moments, too. A night watch when an engineering casualty nearly turned dangerous, a tense man overboard drill that sent my heart racing, the quiet grief after a sailor learned of a tragedy back home. In those moments, my presence mattered. I learned to listen not just with my ears, but with my whole attention. My stateroom door was always open, and the ship knew it. Over time, I built a reputation, not as the XO who barked or played favorites, but as the one who steadied the ship and watched out for her people. The more I leaned into this role, the less I needed to defend my path or compare myself to Sam. The letters from home became less frequent, the texts more formal. My mother checked in every few weeks, her messages always careful, as if she was testing the temperature before plunging in. One evening, as the Roosevelt rode a gentle swell under a star-scattered sky, I received a longer message than usual. Your father told one of his old friends that his daughter's an executive officer now. He acted like it was the most natural thing in the world. I just wanted you to know. I think he's proud, even if he won't say it directly. I stared at the screen, feeling a strange mix of emotions, nostalgia, relief, a bittersweet ache that was hard to name. There was no urge to respond right away, no rush of triumph. Just a sense of balance. The ledger of old hurts and unmet expectations felt, finally, closed. It hit me then. His pride, second-hand and delayed, no longer mattered. The girl who had once measured her value by her father's approval had grown into a woman who stood firm in her own achievements. My satisfaction came from the trust of my crew, the respect I'd earned from peers and subordinates alike. The approval I had always needed was my own. One night, I found myself on the weather deck, the Atlantic stretching out dark and endless under a waning moon. I thought of my parents' house, how the trophies on the mantel had always told just half the story. There were no gold-plated tokens for leadership in a storm, for the quiet courage of making the right call when no one else wanted to. My medals and commendations were stored in a simple box in my stateroom, their meaning private, their worth measured by memory. A new officer joined me, a junior lieutenant who just reported aboard. She stood quietly for a while, then finally asked, "EXO, do you ever miss home?" I considered my answer carefully. Sometimes, I admitted. But I think home is less about a place and more about where you're needed. Right now, that's here. She nodded, understanding more than I expected. It was one of the unspoken truths of Navy life. Your family is the one you build, the people who stand the watch with you, who share the victories and the hardships. That realization didn't erase the pain of the past, but it made the present easier to hold. The Roosevelt became more than just my ship. It was my proof. Proof that the limits set for us by others can be outgrown, that the story of our worth can be rewritten on our own terms. Every day that I put on my uniform and stepped out into the swirl of activity on deck, I reminded myself, you earned this, and you belong. It didn't matter anymore if my father ever said the words aloud. I'd finally learned how to say them to myself. The days aboard the Roosevelt slipped by, a blend of routine and unpredictability, each sunrise a reminder that every day in uniform was both a test and a gift. I found comfort in the rituals, standing inspection, running through emergency drills, reviewing endless readiness reports. Some might call it monotony, but I saw it as rhythm, the beat of a crew in sync, of a ship at its best. In the evenings, when the chaos of the day had ebbed, I sometimes sat alone in my stateroom and let my thoughts wander to the past. I could still picture my father standing on that quarterdeck, stunned into silence as the world shifted beneath him. What I once saw as an impossible mountain to climb, earning his respect, had become almost irrelevant. It wasn't that I no longer cared for my family. I did. But the axis of my world had shifted. I realized that needing their approval had once kept me small, afraid to stand out, hesitant to demand more. That had changed. Now, my value was drawn from the trust of 300 sailors, from the respect of my captain, and, most crucially, from my own sense of purpose. There was one evening in particular that crystallized this shift. We'd just weathered a nasty Atlantic squall, the kind of storm that leaves the entire ship rattling and every sailor bone-tired. As I made my rounds through the mess, I stopped to check on the watch team. Someone handed me a chipped mug of coffee, and the conversation turned from complaints about the weather to a heated debate about who made the best cornbread, Texas, Alabama, or upstate New York. I listened, laughed, even offered my own opinion, and realized that this camaraderie, this mutual reliance, was what I'd been searching for all along. It was a family that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with belonging. My failures back home didn't matter here. Here, I was simply EXO, the one they counted on. A few weeks later, I received another text from my mother. Your father's friend from the chief's mess said he brags about you all the time. He just can't say it to your face. I hope you know we're both proud of you, in our own way. I smiled, reading the message in the dim glow of the stateroom lamp. There was a time when I would have ached for such words, would have read and reread them, clinging to every syllable as proof that I finally belonged. Now, though, I felt only a gentle kind of gratitude. I didn't need their pride as a foundation anymore. I could simply accept it as a gift, whenever it came. That night, I wrote back, simply, "Thank you. I'm happy where I am." I set the phone aside and went to stand on the bridge, looking out over the Black Sea. It struck me that I was building my own legacy, not just as my father's daughter or my brother's sister, but as a leader, a mentor, and a woman who'd fought for her place and kept it through sheer grit and quiet confidence. My story was never going to be the one my father dreamed up in his old Navy days. But it was real. It was honest. And it was mine. Sometimes I wondered what stories the sailors on my crew would tell their own families about the EXO who never raised her voice, who listened, who always remembered birthdays and never missed a chance to tell them. Good work. Maybe they'd remember the time I stood with them in a storm, or the way I made sure every promotion was celebrated, even if only with a joke and a handshake. Legacy, I realized, is not about the medals on your chest or the stories people tell at retirement parties. It's about what you leave behind in the lives of those who trusted you. And every day on the Roosevelt, I was building a legacy that could not be measured by anyone else's standards. As deployment wound down and the Roosevelt prepared to return to port, I felt a deep calm settle in my bones. I no longer felt like I had to prove myself to anyone, not to the Navy, not to my family, not even to myself. The struggle for approval had given way to something far better, a quiet pride in the person I had become. The ocean, with all its moods and dangers, had become my home. I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing I had already conquered the hardest battles, the ones within my own heart. The last days of deployment came with a mixture of anticipation and reflection. The Roosevelt glided into Norfolk under a bright, cloudless sky, its decks alive with the buzz of sailors eager to see land again. As we prepared to moor, I caught my own reflection in the thick glass of the bridge, steadier, perhaps a little older, but entirely at ease. There was no fanfare waiting for me on the pier, no family banner, no cheering crowd. But as I stood in my crisp uniform and supervised the crew's homecoming routine, I realized I didn't need any of it. My welcome home was the salute from the petty officer, the laughter from the junior sailors as they lugged their bags, the grateful nods from parents reuniting with their kids. This was my place, my community, my impact. Later that afternoon, I took a quiet walk along the docks, letting the salt breeze tangle my hair, watching other families embrace. I called my mom from a bench near the water, her voice small and clear through the phone. "How does it feel to be back?" as she asked, and I could hear both hope and worry layered in her words. "It feels good, Mom," I answered honestly. "It feels like I'm coming home as myself." She was silent for a moment. Then, with unusual candor, she added, "Your dad talks about you more than you think. He brags, even if it comes out sideways. I hope you know we're proud of you, Kelly." We just, sometimes didn't know how to say it. It took me a second to respond, but my words were calm and kind. "I know, Mom. And I'm okay. Really. I hope you and Dad are, too." We said our goodbyes, promising to meet up for dinner when their schedule allowed. I hung up feeling something that had always eluded me: peace. Not the peace of victory, but of acceptance. I'd made it. On my own terms. That weekend, I stopped by my parents' house in Roanoke, just for a visit, not a homecoming. The place looked smaller than I remembered, the trophies and photos now tinged with nostalgia instead of longing. Dad met me at the door, uncertain at first, but something in his eyes had changed. We didn't talk about the Navy or the past. Instead, we talked about the present, the garden, Mom's new recipes, the latest Navy news. The silence between us was no longer full of accusations or regret. It was simply a pause, a space for something new. Before I left, Dad handed me a box. Inside were a few of my old academic medals, the ones I'd thought lost or forgotten. He didn't say much, just, "I found these in the attic. Figured you might want them." It was awkward, but it was enough. I hugged him, briefly, stiffly, but real. As I got back in my car, I realized that I didn't need more. Forgiveness, when it came, was quiet. We both understood the language of respect now, even if it would never be said out loud. Back in Norfolk, I dove into work, training new officers, running drills, mentoring young women who reminded me of myself 10 years ago. I became the person I wished I'd had, someone who saw them, challenged them, celebrated every quiet victory. Every time a junior sailor knocked on my door with a question, every time I spotted a flicker of doubt in a young officer's eyes and helped her find her footing, I felt the circle close. The cycle of doubt and approval-seeking ended with me. In the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the masts, I'd sometimes linger on the deck, feeling the ship steady beneath my feet. My legacy was here, woven into the daily lives of my crew, their growth, their resilience, their faith in themselves and each other. I knew there would always be more to prove, more barriers for women, more battles for respect in a world slow to change. But I also knew, with a conviction that ran deeper than words, that I had built something lasting. Not just a career or a reputation, but a sense of self that would not bend with the tides. My story was no longer defined by what my family thought, or by the shadows of old expectations. I was, at last, wholly my own. Epilogue. If you've ever had to build your own legacy when the world told you that you didn't belong, know this: you are seen. Your journey matters. The Navy, like life, doesn't care about who you are on the shore. It cares about who you become on the watch. And I promise you, you're more than enough. As I walk the decks at sunrise, I think of all the daughters, sisters, and so-called